reckon we should begin. There is so many people from so many places on this call, and it's a dark and stormy night in England, which feels very but I totally appreciate that some people are joining in the very early morning or the middle of the day, so welcome everybody. It is a total joy always to come together for these conversations with Nora Bateson and Dave Snowden. Conversations that have been going on for years now. And if you ever want to see some of the previous conversations, they exist on YouTube. This one, I think I'm really looking forward to this one. Abducted by Liminal Ghosts. We're going to mix it up a little bit. And we're already mixing it up because you might have noticed the format has changed. So we are going to be having breakout rooms in this call, but to do our framing of abduction, to really get into lingering with what abduction might be, we're using Star Trek. And we don't actually expect you to remember this episode. I mean, you might have seen it. You might have seen it 25 years ago, but to refresh your memory, we're going to watch 3 clips at the very beginning of this call. Anna is going to give us some context on Darmok, a wonderful episode about the difficulties of communication and meaning making through shared context. And yeah, it is an unconventional way to begin, but we thought the abduction always causes such confusion. Whenever you begin to talk about it, there's always someone who says, are we talking about alien abduction? So we're just going to throw it all in. We're going to dive into that confusion and hope that it's generative. So Anna, will you introduce Darmok?
Of course. So we did send an introduction and some clips in your homework as well. But firstly, we didn't want to assume that anyone had done the homework. And second, when we were preparing for this, we realized that it's actually a lot of fun to watch these things together. And this is what we're going to do. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit. So the year is 2368. Earth is a post-scarcity semi-utopia. We have faster than light travel, and we are using it to explore new planets and new civilizations. Enterprise is one of the starships doing this exploration, and it's the starship we are on for this episode. And in one of those travels, we meet another species called the Tamarians. Now, the Earthlings, I guess I call them our heroes, have trouble communicating with the Tamarians, even though everyone at that time has universal translators, so they should be able to understand what they're saying. In the meantime, the captain of the ship, Captain Picard, has been teleported down to the surface of a mysterious planet, together with the captain of the Tamarian ship they have met, called Dathan. So while they're away, the rest of the crew are exploring their communication conundrum with this Tamarian species, and we're going now to watch a clip from that exploration. And Ellie, I think, will be sharing it with us.
Okay.
Shaka, when the walls fell. He got it. He got it. So, you know, we really had a whistle stop tour of that episode, but surprisingly moving and surprisingly funny to watch it back. Let's have a breakout room where we just get into what we're making of meaning and language and Damak. How is that episode landing in you? And talk it through and get to know some of the other people on this call. Are you going to arrange these breakout rooms? Oh, great. Okay.
Elmi, how are we doing? Are we good to go? Do we need a bit longer? Fabulous. Enjoy your conversation.
Say hi, Basir Rayat from Istanbul, Turkey, Crisis Management. One thing that is, I guess, the universality of the species experience, whether we're human or a different extraterrestrial, there are things that could be similar, but it also carries the prints of a Cold War. How do you engage and how do you find a common conversation? And so, I mean, I'll just leave it for my fellow participants to speak as well. Over. And also we had a very, very foggy day. So I guess the ghosts that you were mentioning already arrived in the early morning until the noon.
Oh my goodness. Here in the Isle of Wight, it is, it's a tempest. It's really...
Hello there.
Hello, Kate.
Hey, Anne.
How are you?
Have you watched the episode of Star Trek? What did you make of it?
I was just having a lovely conversation with my breakout mate, and I pushed the wrong button and ended up back here. So, bada bing, bada boom. Well, you know, I love the use of metaphor, and I've been thinking about my oldest brother, who was a big Star Trek fan, and he's been very ill, so I've been, you know, kind of making my peace with him, as sometimes you have to do with siblings. And I thought, I wonder what he would think of this, you know, what if I just said Dharma to him? And what would it mean to him? Like, what kind of secret language would there be? Because it was such a part of his youth, and it wasn't for me. And to be able to sit down and have a conversation with him about this episode was, you know, it's, you know, it'd be like making the peace. So that's, you know, that's some of my thoughts about the episode, and how deep metaphors run in our culture or across culture.
Yeah, across and in culture.
I have those memories too of watching it with my grandmother. And Star Trek now being this imagined future from, you know, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and the kinds of emotional trails that it has because of that. The people I watched this vision of the future with are no longer living.
Go ahead,
I think
Chris.
Chris, yeah.
Okay, I will break the rules slightly. So instead of sharing what we were discussing in our great group in the chat room, in the breakout room, what it was leading up to when we were brought back is the question that I'd like to pose here, which is that, you know, there is also the need to look at what beyond, forms of dialogue, forms of conversation, we're trying to say, how do we, move the conversation in different ways? How do we dialogue across boundaries? But what about, beyond dialogue and beyond conversation? What other modalities exist to sense and feel your way into things? That's a question that I'd like to sort of pose.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And some of
Chris?
this relates to the abductive point as well. So if you look in British metaphor, there's a fundamental story between the meaningless escalation of violence, which builds up to the First World War, and the failure to actually take action, which builds up to the Second. And if you look at political dialogue in Britain, it's an attempt to associate the current situation with one of those historical situations where from that we know what we do. And I think one of the interesting things here, and I think it comes across in Darmok, is metaphors trigger us into an agreed action. It's not necessarily agreed understanding, but it's also agreed action, because it makes those novel connections, in ways that we wouldn't understand. So, I mean, I'd argue the current position with Russia is actually Weimar Republic, straight down the line, no variation. Well, if you accept that, there are consequences to what NATO should do immediately. And I think it's this way in which all of our myth structures, if you look at the Homeric myths, they're actually historical or purported historical, is the use of historical metaphors to associate with current situations in order to get action is key. And one of the really interesting projects we did for the US government when I was working for Poindexter is we constructed an alternative history of the US in which the South win the Civil War. Based on a counterfactual point in Lincoln doesn't play the slavery cards with the New England Declaration. Now that's still used for policymaking because we can put people into a counterfactual history and get them to explore situations which are actually the current situation without them having to think about it. So I think some of this is how do we get these associated meanings or agreements to action? And agreement to action is not the same thing as common understanding. Yeah, I'm meandering around that a bit, but
I mean, what we're talking about is in the metaphorical realm. So in something that is beyond direct communication, there is a way in which what I say is shaping what you say, and we aren't paying attention to that. So we are essentially moving each other's thoughts. And I think that's very important in terms of what we're agreeing upon without knowing we're agreeing on it. If you look at the things that, for those of you who watched the whole episode, they have these statements, Shaka, when the walls fell, which is about failure. And they have, you know, when they walked, they were on the ocean, and they left together. So there's like collaboration and loneliness and love. And we also have unspoken metaphors that are lurking behind all sorts of things that we're saying that are indications toward what is success, what is failure, what is collaboration, what is loneliness, what is right. And these things are intrinsic, and they're reflecting from multiple directions, which is where the abductive thing is coming from. And Chris, you have been waiting and waiting, so you should definitely dive in.
Yeah, I had lots of things that I kind of was thinking about it all. And even while people are talking now, I'm thinking, like, to me, they almost felt a little autistic in their focus on it for a couple of reasons. They didn't seem to intuit a need to provide context, which was quite interesting. But interestingly, Picard, through all of his encountering other races and so on. And everyone else on the Enterprise also seemed to get lost in metaphor a little bit, or not understand where they were going with it, because it was almost this kind of need to jump into an overly complex thing. And the reason I say that is because right at the end, and William mentioned this, the second in command of the Tamarian ship nodded twice for yes. So clearly gesture is something that's quite direct and doesn't have metaphor attached to it, so they can understand that. But if they're also associating it with images, and gesture comes before we learn language, and you can impart meaning from gesture, I was curious as to why nobody thought to try and communicate using images or gestures before everything else, which seemed a little over complex. And I found that really interesting.
Need the context first. I mean, the point where they hand over the knives and the use of the knife when he gets back to the Enterprise, that's significant. But the gesture only has meaning because of the common lived experience. I think that's the key point, is they have to have a common lived experience for the metaphor to have any power.
And it was the assumption of dueling rather than...
Everything else follows from that, right? Which I think is the key point in the episode.
But it was exactly that. It was kind of the idea that, you know, I don't want to fight you, stop giving me a weapon, when in fact he was saying we need to face something together, and neither of them quite got that. The last thing I picked up on was there's no sense of self thing, because the captain had a unique name, but that was just something that I picked up on that I thought was interesting as well. But anyway, there were just some interesting thoughts on it.
When we were talking about this beforehand, one of the things I pointed out is it's quite significant that Data the android gets the fact they're using metaphor.
And
that's actually reasonably significant, because it's then that sets the trail that follows from that.
James, you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's a little bit on what Dave was just mentioning there. For me, the key thing was that when they were communicating on the bridge, it was almost like two Zoom conversations, and that wasn't very effective. So what they did is he found the need to actually put them into the trenches, into the situation together. And for me, the key aspect outside of it is because from afar, they couldn't work it out. He had to have the lived experiences, which is actually where the real learning came on. It didn't matter what either of them were trying to understand, is because they shared that space. That's for me why that's where the communication became effective. They could have had opposing views, but they had to do that process. And even the conversations around that, when they kept going back to the different ships, their processing was much slower and less effective than actually just two people. They had all the great minds of all of the ships to try and figure it out, and they couldn't. Lived experience down to sort of the nuts and bolts of it all was much more effective. So yeah, Zoom calls didn't even work even in that situation.
But neither did the Tamarian solution of, okay, let's go and have this ritual on the planet. They still didn't have enough context yet. So it was, first of all, the communication channels, Zoom conversation, they didn't have the context. Okay, let's go down a level of granularity almost. But then still that context wasn't there. So then the two of them on the planet needed to just spend some time in each other's presence, figuring out how can we start to communicate.
It goes back to the narrative, doesn't it? It was all the experiences of not lighting the fire together, sharing the fire, him throwing in the fire, all the little micro narratives, his response, actually, at no point was he aggressive, but actually there was no word said. All of those little bits eventually started to get to the point, I would suggest, where he suddenly started to understand what it was that he was meaning. It's not what he said to him, it's what the experience that led him to go, oh, I'm getting a sense of what it is that you're saying to me.
I think it has more relevance for us as well, having lived through the COVID period.
Yeah,
it's been fascinating going from Zoom to getting back in front of physical audiences and realizing just how different it is. Now, yeah, I know a lot of the science of it. I know a lot of things are based on pheromone traces and sense and things we don't understand yet. But knowing the science isn't the same thing as experiencing a difference.
I think that's the worst thing we've done.
A 2-year period without physical contact with other human beings from different backgrounds nearly drove me insane. Yeah, because the conversation on Zoom is not the same thing.
It's funny,
I
actually.
saw it the first time you and I met was in that sitting on those chairs.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Stockholm, realizing we hated all the same people. that couldn't have worked in Zoom, all right? It was.
I don't think there's many global things where we've all experienced the same thing. That's quite unique as well in the COVID. There's not many things that I can pick one other person and go, they've experienced what I've had, or not experienced. That's interesting.
Thea, you've been so patient. Thank you. Oh, did you just disappear?
Nope.
Oh, okay. Letitia.
Yeah, hi. I was just listening back there to when Dave Snowden was saying something about how metaphors bring examples from the past. And I was reminded of Otto Scharmer saying that one of the things that happens when we face problems is that we keep trying to solve them looking back instead of from the emerging future, as he calls it, being open to something new, because we keep seeing new problems as old ones. So our solutions to them are not adequate. And so I wonder in communication how that happens.
Well,
Because I keep going back to what is inside my mind and in my past and projecting it onto the speech of the person that I'm listening to. And that's not necessarily what's going on. And I have, like, in the breakout rooms, I was talking to some lovely guys, and I had an example, which is just recently in a WhatsApp group, a person made a reference to the people who are now blockading streets in Brazil, roads in Brazil, against the legitimate results of the election. And she said she was supporting them for justice. Justice, she used that word. And it was interesting to me because inside of me, the word justice, and inside of her, I'm quite sure they mean the same thing. But in concrete reality, it turns up in a very different way. I'm not sure I'm making myself understood because it's not my first language. But, you know, just the manifestation, the concrete manifestation of justice is very different for me and for her, you know.
There's some interesting connections between that and your reference to Otto, all right? And just to be wicked here, but it's deliberate and intentional. It's a great pity that Sharma thinks we should think about new things, but he can only think about it in the context of a North American interpretation of the Enlightenment. So all of his solutions are highly culturally specific, based on a specific history and a specific cultural determinism. So he doesn't break away from it himself, right? And I think one of the key things is we have to understand where we are in the context of our path. This is one of the key complexity lessons. We're always on journeys from the present. So, I mean, and a lot of us have now been talking about we need a renaissance, not an enlightenment. Yeah, the enlightenment is throwing away the old to take on the new. That's never going to work. We have to create new novelty out of our understanding of the past and also new things. And I think that's one thing. I think the other thing we're seeing in the modern age, and it relates to that, is the language of the Enlightenment, things like justice and freedom of speech. All of that language has now been taken over almost completely by the far right and populism. So if you look at the support for Canadian truckers, it was, you know, you got people like Jim Rutt, who I'm getting deeply suspicious of, yeah, who basically said, this is all about free speech. I don't agree with them, but they have a right to say it. At the same time as far right money is flooding in, yeah, to that instance. So I think what you're seeing is that the language and the lessons of the Enlightenment have effectively been grabbed by the, you know, right-wing libertarians. And that language and concept is now lost to us. So we've got to create a new way of thinking forward. And it's not based around the Enlightenment ideas, I don't think.
I think we're seeing this in all sorts of language too, Dave. You know, the language, even the word complexity has been absorbed now into, you know, and you know, I think about the decades in which so much of, you know, what you've been saying, what I've been saying, certainly what my father said and his father was working on, and, you know, it has been incomprehensible. It didn't land into the existing systems. That, so it was, I mean, I have to say that, you know, speaking to Ward, doing work and projects and on the ground mutual learning processes, et cetera, that don't have an endpoint, that don't have a predetermined goal, that don't have something that you can say you're going to get before you get it. It has been as incoherent as speaking in metaphor. And so I think that it's really important to pay attention to what are the logics of an industrial epistemology and the metaphors that are creeping in everywhere that confirm it. And it's just that everywhere thing that is the issue, because it comes in through education, it comes in through health, it comes in through politics, it comes in through family, it comes in through economics, so that it's actually in the details of the day. It's in the implicit communication of the day. And one of the things that is interesting for me in this piece is the implicit, the way in which the Tamarians have an implicit understanding that if you're going to communicate, you should communicate from this, from within the context that is resonating for them. Now, the fact that they don't provide context on their context is no different than, frankly, most of us. You know, if you're in a situation that's even a different culture, people don't provide context on why they're doing things differently. They're just doing it. And if you can't keep up, you're just confused. So I think, you know, one of the things that is important for what I think we're all here for is this question of how do we actually provide the opportunity for new abductive process to take place so that it becomes possible to get out of the tautology of the communication that we've been stuck in. And you get stuck in it because you can't see it. And, you know, everybody does it. So it's
some of that, I think, is flipping the metaphor, right? So I think you're right. I mean, the language of complexity, the world and his wife have now produced complex solutions. And I'm just waiting for the agile community to produce certificates in complexity. It's only a matter of time before they do it, all right? And you've got people who've been arguing against complexity for the last 30 years in systems dynamics and cybernetics, who suddenly decided they're into complexity because they like the language, right? Metaphors are far more difficult for people to abuse. I mean, if you actually look at, say, the Bible stories, which are metaphors of a type. I mean, I'll give you an example. I once had to run a one-week course on hermeneutics for a Southern Baptist college in the States. It was a weird combination of events which got me there. And I decided I was going to run the New Samaritan experiment, the Good Samaritan experiment, on the basis I'm a Catholic teaching Southern Baptist, so I'm not subject to any ethical considerations. Yeah, anything I do will just take years off purgatory the more I upset them. So I was going on that sort of basis, right? And if you don't know the Good Samaritan experiment, the way you do it is you set people up to talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And all the parables in the Bible are ambiguous. They're not definitive. They're all ambiguous. That's how metaphors work. And it's how they get precision. And basically, we taught them that. Yeah. And then we sent them out and on a treasure hunt in the afternoon. And when they were all on the treasure hunt trying to find prizes to win a Bible, yeah, we had actors fall by the wayside injured, and we videoed them ignoring the actors. I mean, it's a really vicious experiment. It's been run many times. What was interesting is that we had a control group who were given a value statement about looking after other people. when we showed them the videos, the people who had the value statement argued that they'd done the right thing in context. The people who'd started off with the metaphorical parable basically agreed they'd done the wrong thing. So that there's less ambiguity of negative interpretation in narrative than there is in explicit statements. And I think, coming back to the earlier point, we've got to start to change the metaphors through which people see life, rather than the language. The language is less important than the metaphors. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's very clear in this piece, that this direct communication flattens the eternal meaning.
So to give another illustration, I'm giving a lecture, I'm taking a part-time position at George Mason in the Carter Center, when the first lecture on this is in November. And what we're trying to do there on peace and reconciliation is to bring people together from Republicans and Democrats in very small groups of people to work on hyper-local problems identified by those groups, so that they build a common experience, at which point they can have a talk about their political differences. Now, this is the exact opposite of what you see from the Sangis and the Sharmakas in this world, which is a classic Boston liberal concept. If we just need to get people together and get them agree that somehow or other magically things will be different. Yeah, and I think this creating shared stories through common experiences is the way you overcome barriers. It's not by a sort of talk fest in a big workshop facilitated by somebody who comes from a specific cultural bias background anyway. Yeah. I'm not disputing the motivation, by the way. I just think I'm disputing the effectiveness.
Thea, you're back. I can see you.
Mm.
Welcome, welcome.
Go on, Thea. You've been terribly patient. Go for it.
Oh, I'm not quite sure, but if I can express what came to mind, but these metaphors are so deep, and when I saw these videos, I thought, oh wow, what have I seen as a kid, and what did I take up without knowing, without knowing, and in the breakout room there was Kay, and she said she's communicating about whole films which hold meaning in a playful way, and I got it is so deep. Those metaphors go so deep, and it is so interesting to investigate in your own roots of metaphors. And today, this enterprising was really really interesting. It was wow. Thank you.
I mean, in Thea, just to respond on that, and the people will tell you earlier, when we watched that video before the conference, I couldn't speak after I watched that endpoint. Yeah, it's terribly emotional, that point. You're almost in tears when you hear that conversation, because it's also this concept of creating shared metaphors through common suffering, which is fundamentally human, right? It's what Terry Eagleton talks about as radical sacrifice. The whole concept of sacrifice is fundamental to human sense making. And libertarian culture loses that. Yeah.
And not only human, it is life in these sequences, other life, alien life.
I think people who patiently holding up your hands, if you get a gap, just jump in and do it. All right, don't wait. I mean, we're not being inhibited anyway, so why should you?
I think Robert's next.
There are more than one Robert in here.
No, it's you.
You, Robert.
Yeah. So with every comment, my notes have expanded here. on how to frame this. In the end, what Picard learned was which metaphors to use, how to use the symbols in interaction, symbolic interaction, if you will. He gained some common experience, and it served the purpose in the end of departing not enemies. And he still didn't have a clue what happened. No one had a clue what happened. They just all kind of knew that what happened wasn't bad in that context. So when we talk about things like pluralism, as in the context of left-wing liberalism, we might be suffering from some of the same problems. A lot of in the U.S., and you know, I have an unapologetic U.S. perspective, but in the U.S., a lot of the diversity stuff and shared kind of working to gain shared experience came about as a result of globalism, and the diversity paradigm in the U.S. emerged by accident. It was globalism that actually drove the desire for understanding other cultures in the US, so the US executives could go overseas and run business divisions. It wasn't about equity, it wasn't about equality, it wasn't about cultural competence for the sake of relationship building. It was so US executives wouldn't fail at a rate of about 70%. This is the way they were failing. And so someone came up with the idea of interculturalism and learning more about the people you were going to work with. And Raymond Aron, long ago, even before that, wrote about the disconnection of physical borders from culture. It used to be, if you wanted to get a good exposure to French culture, you had to go to France. And maybe some places within France specifically. That's not true anymore. If you wanted to get African-American culture, you had to come to the US to get it, at least, you know, prior to World War II. That wasn't true anymore at some point after World War II. So that disconnection of national borders from culture also drove some of the diversity stuff and the liberal concepts of pluralism. But what's happening now is globalism is fading. It's about to come to an end, maybe not next year, but you know, down the road. And so from the right-wing perspective, the conservative perspective, and again, from a US perspective, the conservatives in the US were never interested in assimilating into a global culture. And so the right-wing view of pluralism here, even though it's not necessarily stated this way, is that we want to preserve this culture and what happens inside of our borders. So it became an America first, you know, mentality in order to structurally reestablish the borders between America and everywhere else. Maybe Brexit was influenced to some extent by that same kind of thinking. And so I see, you know, right-wing and left-wing sort of what look like opposites in terms of how we see pluralism, because there are countries that never really played the whole globalization thing. They just kind of stuck their toes in the water, but backed away from it in reality. Never bought into it totally.
But it's a really interesting issue on this. What globalism did and neoliberalism did is they homogenized differences.
Yeah.
And that's what you're getting picked up with the Sharmakas, the Senghis of this world, this attempt to create an homogenized state based on a particular ideology. And I think one of the points about the Dharma episode is the ability to handle conflict. It's what we talk about when we talk about coherent heterogeneity rather than homogeneity. Yeah, human beings need differences. If we don't have any difference, we create one. If you look at some of the studies of conflict, they're more likely to happen between people who are very similar than people who are very different. because we like to create those divisions. And I think the issue is, how do you create an ability to maintain the differences, but to create coherence, for example, around global warming or other issues, right? And part of the problem here is this Enlightenment concept of the grand strategy. So, I mean, the Paris Accords were never going to succeed because they're completely at the wrong level of granularity, and they don't change the dispositional state so that people are prepared to change their lifestyle. You've got to change that middle bottom up, all right? It's not top down or bottom up. It's something very different. And I think we've lost the ability to accept difference. One of the things which really, really pisses me off in conversations is people want everybody's opinions to have equal value and equal status. If I look at the work we're doing with the indigenous groups have no concept that everybody has an equal voice. Voices are different based on authority and experience. Yeah, and we've got to have that ability to handle conflict and handle authority without this homogenization into all views are equally valid.
There is this wonderful non-linearity to what is emerging in this call, but because I know Nora and Dave are wanting to speak directly to each other next, shall we just take Gil and Basir's question and then move on to that last piece of the call, because we have the clock. Gil.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. I'll try to be concise, although it's challenging with all these pieces moving in me and weaving in me. Gosh, thank you, everybody. You know, the Enterprise crew in the first clip did talk about context and their sort of understanding of the importance of grasping the context within which the communications were happening, although they are not as skilled at that as Picard was. Nora, you talked about the challenge of surfacing the implicit. You said providing context on my context, on our context, on their context, and it seems an enormous challenge because it's invisible even to ourselves. You know, Dave, you talked about the being stuck in the metaphors of World War I or World War II, which gives you a different story. You know, and are we I am, you know, me here, my context is all of the history of me, right? My marriage, my family of origin, my culture that I live in, the history that I come out, the national history I come out of, the tribal history that I come out of, all of those are there in the context, right? And so we can't act without it. We can't act trapped from it. We can't be limited by it, but we can't ignore it. This is a complicated business that we're in here. And then how to convey that to someone else. Dave, you said that, what did you say? That metaphors are hard to abuse. And I love the Good Samaritan story is a great one, but metaphors are also hard to interpret in a shared way. In the hermeneutics in the Jewish tradition, there's, you know, thousands of years of unpacking these metaphors in profoundly different ways, with profoundly different interpretations of what they say. And yet in the normative Anglo culture, people are reading a sacred text in English that was translated from the Greek, that was translated from the Aramaic, and hold fiercely to the words in English, which have great meaning, but are a very different meaning than what may have been spoken, 2,000 years ago. So this is a very rich puzzle, and I'm delighted in it. Thank you for it.
I'm glad.
Just throw something in on that, which is the 1,000 years of interpretation is part of the way that metaphors build.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's not just the story. I mean, we were talking about this before when we had a brief earlier on in the morning. I mean, we've been doing all of this stuff with Tyson and other people in the indigenous communities, and the Welsh get it because we're an oral tradition. In the oral tradition, the stories are constantly shifting and changing in the act of telling. And one of the disasters in the European tradition is that Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm wrote down the fairy stories. So they made them static and quaint, and they stopped becoming a living tradition of meaning making. yeah, in multiple human exchanges. So I think the passage of interpretation is key, right? I think, you know, a lot went wrong with the Reformation and the Enlightenment in that it came into this absolutist, things are right or wrong. And you get into the sort of, you know, Calvin took the worst of Augustine and Augustine took the worst of St. Paul. You know, so you get into this sort of nightmare of authority in text and the spoken word, rather than the lived and embodied experience and the development of narrative tradition over time. And I think that was lost. I mean, one thing, sorry, I'm not making a preach here, but there are three sources of revelation in Catholicism. Yeah, one is that body of teaching. There is the Bible, but it's only one of three. And the other is the lived experience in the world. Yeah, and all of those are sources of revelation. And we lost that because of that dominance of the written word, the spoken authority, yeah, and the sort of the divides which came with that.
Yeah. So Dave,
and in fact, those became the reference points. I mean, that's the issue, is that there's always a reference. There's always a whole context that's being redescribed through what is taking place in the communication. And so it's that thing of that the reference points are now they're pinging off of those things that have been separated. And so this is where I think we are where you say, Gil, that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do because it's very difficult at this point to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to give metaphors that will allow for connections and references to be made, because you can't just have one. Yeah. You have to have multiple metaphors that are pinging off each other, that are reframing each other, that are shaping and flavoring each other. It's an ecology of metaphors, even.
And part of the modern mess is that we claim that we can have an abstracted reference point that is true and true for all time,
and that's an issue.
That is, instead of this more ecological. Dave, you talked about. I mean, how do we find, I don't know if your word was cultural, the coherent heterogeneity or common purpose or common action for large complex messes like climate in this more diffuse, highly variable
I mean, that's
dance?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, I mean, the sort of work we're currently doing on estuarine mapping, which is one of the things I'm most excited about at the moment, which is taking constructor theory from physics and applying it to human systems, is the ability to identify where you have the lowest energy cost of shifting the dispositional state of the system. So you stop trying to solve the problem and you start to create an energy gradient in which solutions to the problem are more likely to emerge. All right, now that to me has always been key. Yeah, in a lot of these things. I think the other thing is this is the aparatic concept, which we introduced about 2 years of bringing Derrida's stuff across. If you look at key phrases in the Bible, and the Bible is part of our common heritage, we can't ignore it. It's the tradition that, along with Homer. And I was saying to Nora before we came onto this, my mother, who was a good atheist, made me read the whole of the Bible by the time I was 11. I punished her by becoming a Catholic for doing that to me. But she said I wouldn't understand European literature if I didn't know the Bible because of and the same is true of Homer. I mean, somebody said to me the other day when I said, "Oh, rosy fingered dawn," and they said, "Oh, that's wonderful poetry. Yeah, how did you think of that?" And you're thinking, "Oh, for God's sake, haven't you read anything?" All right, in terms of the reference. Yeah. So I think if you look in the Bible, you get these wonderful things like "Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's." What the Judeo-Christian tradition does in the Bible is ask people questions which can't be resolved other than by thinking differently. And the parables and metaphors all do that. They force people into a position where they have to think differently about a problem. They don't actually provide the solution. And I think that's really important, and that sort of matches in with complexity theory.
I think that's really important, Dave, especially in this right now. I think, there's a kind of a fad around we need a new narrative.
Oh God,
as though the idea, because you know, a narrative is a metaphor, as though the idea were to just insert a pre-constructed story that could become the new narrative. Now, I think this is not only ridiculous but dangerous, because narrative, like you just said, narrative stories come out of questions, especially questions that cannot be answered. So you don't start by weaving answers. You start by asking different questions. So what I saw in the clips there in this piece was that what Picard's learning was not about learning a new language. He was learning about a new possibility of communication, and that's not the same thing. He was learning to actually think about what could be communicated in an entirely different way. And I love that, you know, the Star Trek people actually bring us on that journey. It's such a gift. It's a great piece on this. Because if we start to think we need to make a new narrative, already that process is being generated from the same epistemology that is actually generating the problems. So it's not shifting into a different abductive process. It's actually just trying to get better at the same game instead of thinking about what could be possible in a different context. And that's a big shift. And I think it's possible to do that. I mean, art is what allows that to happen.
So and that's when we get into this whole field of semiotics, which we explored last year, and aesthetics. So what semiotics and aesthetics do is they enable abductive thinking, because they disconnect us from the material to the point where we can see novel connections. And I mean, one of the things you and I again talked about earlier, I've been fairly open the last 6 months on social media about the fact I'm dyslexic. And I've never hidden it, but I've just got more aggressive about saying, look, guys, if one more person sends me a sarcastic email about me not having a valid opinion because my spelling is wrong, would you please go and shoot yourself, because no dyslexic in living memory has been able to spell accurately. Yeah, that's kind of like the way it works. But the thing about dyslexia is I mean, there's some wonderful stuff come out on this. It's been fascinating to get feedback from people. You suddenly make connections between things, and you can't see why anybody else is getting confused, because the connection is completely obvious. All right. And I think, you know, the whole neurodiversity thing, dyslexia does seem to be very tightly correlated with innovation, all right, or thinking in novel ways. But that sort of throwing novel things together doesn't work well in a modern business or government environment. And you've got this secondary phenomenon. We've seen this in a lot of government. When they've written the policy, they think they've done all they need to do.
Right.
And that would be that's my other argument against Shamika. We've had the workshop, we've agreed how we should all be, or God help us, the inner development goals, which are one of the worst things I've ever seen to come out of Scandinavia. Right? You know, we've all agreed that what sort of change we need. So magically now it's all going to happen. Yeah.
Well, it's a total abstraction. It's you know, if you say we need to build trust, that's
so what? Yeah.
So what does that mean? I mean, I think this points to that the we need to build trust statement is an abstraction from all the granularity of who I am when I'm with you, and my ability to perceive context, to perceive you and I as entities that are shifting in relationship to each other.
It's a major confusion of the last 30 years of systems thinking, right? In that they observe a desirable quality, which is actually an emergent property of multiple interactions over time. And then so it's like creativity. Yeah, people who are innovative are creative. It doesn't mean if you run creativity programs, people will become innovative. If you put people in positions of stress, then they will become creative. And this confusion of emergent properties and assuming emergent properties have downwards causal capability bedevils leadership theory, change theory, everything else for the last 30 years. And it's just bad logic and bad science.
So interesting how art and poetry are being used in the Iran revolution, that they are speaking something that isn't possible to say in any other way. I just want to ask Basir for your question, and then we're going to move on because, yes, Basir, please.
I'll make it very quick. Now, one thing that I've noticed when the Tamarians are using allegory and then metaphors in their language, are they somehow restricting the language in the way it is kind of like an AI echo chamber, or is it a keeper of tradition and then enriching it perhaps one way or another? And Dave gave me $1 million answer. I mean, I'm practically a millionaire on the policy front. The tradition of Anderson, the Danish tradition versus the Welsh tradition, or just oral tradition, because I have seen a couple of folks who are on the policy front foresight have become very static, so much that I was just identifying it as groupthink. And then so I will tell my colleagues, stop reading the fairy tales and throw out the fairy tale hat. Cheers.
I mean, one of the things we've always done when we've done policy is that policy should be written retrospectively based on what worked.
Yeah.
And policy doesn't engender correct action. Policy is a retrospective form of coherence for future learning. And it's like this: we'll talk about it, we'll decide what to do. Actually, what you need to do is to change the interactions of people with other people and with the planet, and then respond to the things which are starting to shift people in the right direction, which may not be a direction you could have anticipated.
And this is something, frankly, that the right has understood better than the left.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, their funding follows. I mean, and we talked about this last time, a lot of the funding is now going to new age movements.
Yeah.
So if a new age movement starts to get traction, it gets right-wing funding because it will distract people from engaging with real problems.
If you change the policy, you don't change the behavior.
And again, that's my problem within the development goals. I mean, there was some idiot online the other day who said, until we change the way we think, the planet can't be saved. Well, at that point, just give up. All right. It's just the wrong way of thinking about it. You'll change the way you think when you engage in the planet in a different way. Yeah.
Well, that's, I think, a really great place to start from, because you don't change the way you think. The way you think is actually produced in relationship to your family, in relationship to your language, your culture, your children, your ancestors. And I think it's part of why we called this, the liminal ghosting time, because this thing that we're talking about isn't in any one place. And you can't just reach under the hood and replace the part. It's not like that. It's in a multi-relational process that this thing is perpetuated, is confirmed, is mutually shifted, so that we can, begin to use the word systems and complexity to mean something very different than they used to mean. And you can make a good sales pitch with them now, even get a grant. Not very many years ago, people just looked at you sideways and left you behind. So I think that it's
there's some very
absolutely essential to come into this type of interaction that addresses the intimacy. Okay, so I just did this talk the other day with Daniel Schmachtenberger on intergenerational relationships. And to me, what's really important about that is that in that intergenerational relationship is how you do breakfast. It's in the way that you have an implication of whose turn it is to do dishes. That is actually saying all sorts of things across generations about what is success, what is failure, what is lovable, who are you, how are we going to be in relationship, how will you fit in to the world that you're in. And this notion of being, contextually squished into a way of understanding how to learn, understanding how to learn how to be in the world.
Yeah, and there's some interesting stuff on this. I mean, I can tell you from personal lived experience that breakfast in Daniel's house is an interesting experience, but I'll go into that when we're on our own sometime, all right? And I think the problem with Daniel and that group is they're all concerned about how we create this meta framework in which the elite will see the world differently. I mean, the whole concept of metamodernism, I think, is problematic on that, right? But I also think there's this key issue. I mean, if you look at what's happening in cognitive neuroscience at the moment, Andy Clark and Elseth, both in different ways, are saying that human consciousness is a series of hallucinations. Yeah. Now, actually, Clark is even better on this, because as we start to hallucinate, we start to take action in order to get feedback to validate which hallucinations we should act on. And this is happening in a micro level, right? Now, I think that really has major implications for the way you achieve change. And that's coming from a variety of different sources. If you look at Walter Freeman's work, there are chemicals which break up neuroreceptors, so we never remember anything quite the same way twice. Because if we remember things the same way twice, our view of the world would become static. So that constant mutation is key, right? I think the second thing, the intergenerational stuff to me has always been important. We pioneered transgenerational pairs, putting young people to people with their grandparents' generation to come up with ideas. And that was partly linked to brain plasticity, but it was also linked to our history, where grandparents were the primary child carers, where the parents were hunting or farming in various combinations, depending on what books you read. So basically, the time for leisure and reflection was in young people and old people, not in people in the middle group. And starting to resurrect that intergenerational meaning making is something we're now trying to do at scale, right? And then, you know, you've got novelty, you've got experience, you've got networks. So there's a lot of scientific stuff coming out which supports what you and I have been saying for years, Nora, and acting on, which actually allows us to understand how to scale some of the stuff. And that's the point I've been making to the systems thinking community. Nobody's saying you guys didn't deal with complexity. Yeah, we all accept that, all right? People built canals before Newton. They understood gravity in practice. But after Newton, we had the science. And once we had the science, we could start to scale it. Right? So I think finding the science to allow scaling is going to be key on this.
Yeah. And I want to take this opportunity while you and I are in this room to actually talk about abductive process for a minute.
Yeah.
Because
we need to be talking about. So
yeah, we really do. And I've been waiting a very long time for us to be able to do this, because both of our work is actually contingent deeply on recognition of abductive process. And, you know, there are a lot of different ways to describe it. Charles Saunders Peirce started off talking about abduction as being a way in which a hypothesis could be generated. So something that was understood in one context would give an indication, something to hold on to, some pattern, something recognizable, so that when you're in a completely different context, you might use what you learned over here to make a hypothesis about what's happening here. But that, I think, is only one way of thinking about a very interesting phenomenon. And what's interesting for me about the phenomenon of abductive process is that it really gets deeply ecological. So for me, the relationship between abductive process and ecology is relevant. But I'm not just talking about ecology of the living world around us. I'm also talking about ecologies of ideas. In so much as the way my dad described it was more that what you learned and what you could see in one context became a description of what was seen in another context. And that the different aspects, so if you look at a family, the child's is a description of the way that the mother and the parents are in relationship with their work and the world around them, and so on and so forth. That all of these different aspects of any complex living system become descriptions of each other. That's fascinating.
Right now, I mean, your paper readiness, all right, is really interesting in this, because that's where you first make that distinction between your approach to abduction and Peirce, right? Now, I'm not 100% sure I agree with you. That's all that Peirce meant by abduction, but I say I haven't gone back to the books to double check, right?
It's a basis, yeah.
And of course, Dewey modifies that a lot anyway, although indirectly on abduction, right? But I think there is this common view of abduction, and you're seeing this now in the way the AI community is picking up on abduction. It's all about hypothesis generation, right? Now, yes, abduction does that, but that's very restricted. I think this context of you and your father about how I take effectively one thing from one context to understand another context in a different way, that's also powerful. Some of our work is trying to actually change the granularity of that. And to me, granularity is key to abduction. If you don't get the granularity right, you can't create novel connections.
Totally agree.
So one of the things we're about to start a project on in South Wales is to entangle the micro narratives of medical staff, social workers, and the community, to identify patterns in that entanglement, which would allow us to discharge patients early from hospital. Because if I can improve that by 24 hours, what we're trying to do is to get the insight into where there's a connection between something in the community and medical practice. Right? Now, I'm interested in that on how we create abduction at scale. And I think you're right to say it's an ecological metaphor, and we picked up on Kaufman's work on fitness landscapes. So one of the ways we indicate a novel connection is by showing an outlier on the fitness landscape. And again, I think what you're trying to do is to move away from the requirement to have gifted people to creating processes which get people to look at things in different ways. And again, this is a big switch over the last 30 years of leadership development. And the whole competence idea, I think, is crazy, right? Is shifting away from that into scalable types of process which create the right type of interaction. And we had a long conversation with Tyson and his mates about this when I was in Australia. It also changes people's interaction with the planet. It's not just with other people, yeah? And I think that's where abduction gets interesting, because if we can create processes which create novel associations, regardless of people's individual ability, we can start to do stuff at scale.
So the way that I work with it is a little bit different, but not so different in a way. So the warm data process is, I'll start with a question, right? We talked about narrative requiring a question that is beyond any kind of simple answer. And that then in the participants move through multiple contexts and they play with this question. And one of the things that happens is that it becomes very clear that any personal story that you tell, any personal story, right? Anytime you get into the granularity of a personal experience, that story is going to be completely transcontextual. It's going to hold family and economics and culture and history, and it's going to hold science, it's going to hold spirituality and religion, it's going to hold all these different contexts in it. And when you get multiple stories, I think of it more as a moire phenomenon than an entanglement, but it is a living moire. It's not static patterns. So it's definitely this way in which, as you know, over the course of about an hour and a half, a group of people begin to perceive their own personal memories and experiences through many different contexts and viewpoints. And so the abductive process that they perceive their own life in shifts. Now, what's interesting for me is not what comes out of the lab. I am absolutely not interested in that. What I'm interested in is how those people go on to do the next thing, So it's not about what we harvest out of the Warm Data Lab, but more what sort of changes take place.
Okay, now
that-
this is a similarity and a key difference. So I think we have the same concept about how you do this. But what we're trying to do is scale independently of facilitation. So one of our goals is to remove facilitation completely from the process so that things can happen at scale. And it's quite interesting. If you look at the history of religion, it actually did it quite effectively. So I'm going to be unprogressive here. One of the major mistakes the Catholic Church made in Vatican II is to get rid of the Latin Mass and get rid of ritual. Yeah, because actually the church was never about the vernacular. It was about a shared experience and a shared understanding. And what ritual does is it creates a space for liminality. It creates a space in which we can make connections. And it doesn't have to be made explicit. The tyranny of the explicit is a big problem. Yeah. So I think
this is
there's a lot of biology now which basically says human beings cannot avoid being religious. It's part of what we are as a species. We just can't avoid it. So if we don't have a formal religion, we create another type of religion, and the populists are playing on that. Yeah, if you look at the way it works, right? So I think the issue for me is, how do we allow meaning making and abduction at scale without the need for facilitation? So I think we're agreed on the mechanism, but where we go from that is a difference and a similarity.
I promised you a ghost story. So I want to bring this in because I think it ties this all together of, you know, what was in the Star Trek episode and also in this abductive question. And then also what it is we're doing. What are we doing anyway? Who's we and what are we doing? So I have these ancestors, my father and his father before him. And William, my grandfather, was, he was talking about interconnected species in biology and doing genetics through the lens of what we would now call cybernetics or systems thinking before the turn of the century. And doing this in the academy in Cambridge. So clearly ancient cultures around the world have forever been doing a study of nature through these ways of seeing, but to do it inside the academy before the turn of the century was another type of challenge. And he lost so much credibility because he stuck to his guns. He didn't sell out. And the words that he wrote and the work that he did got dismissed for 100 years. And then they started to figure out, oh, actually, he was right. And my dad went through a similar thing. He was working in a lot of different fields. And one of the fields that he was interested in was actually psychology. But let me frame this, okay? Because he was actually interested in how it was possible to perceive the world outside of the various patterns and matrix, like shapes that everyone gets stuck in their own epistemological box. So he worked with people who were interested in trance, and he worked with people who were from other cultures, and he worked with people who were different ages. And he worked with people who had mental health issues and addictions. And he worked with dolphins and people who were experimenting with psychedelics. All of these were possibilities of perceiving outside of the patterns that we've been talking about. So one time he was working in the VA, I think the VA hospital, and he was working with a person who had been identified with schizophrenia. And the patient came in, and since Gregory wasn't a doctor, he had a certain kind of freedom, but he also couldn't make any decisions. So the person came in, the guy came in, And he came in the room, it was the 50s, and my dad offered him a cigarette because that was perfectly normal in that time period. And then that was a gesture of friendship. And then he offered him the matches. Now that's a whole different kind of gesture, right? You're not supposed to give people with very volatile diagnoses the matches. So that was a message, wasn't it? And it said, we are in a different kind of relationship, and I'm going to give you the matches. And the man took the matches and he lit his cigarette, and he took a couple of puffs and he dropped it on the floor. And he didn't even look down. He just dropped it. And it's burning a hole in the floor. And my father looked down, didn't reach down to grab the cigarette. He looked down at it and he said, if I were that angry at somebody, I'd tell them so. And the man looked at my dad and he said, a man would like to go for a walk. Meanwhile, the cigarette's still burning the rug. And so he's sitting there and they get up and they go outside and they get halfway down the sidewalk. And my dad says, I just can't handle it. I got to go deal with that cigarette. It's burning a hole. So he runs back. The next day, same thing. He comes in. My dad offers him a cigarette. He takes the matches. He lights a cigarette. He takes a few puffs. He drops it on the floor. Same thing. My dad says, if I were that angry at somebody, I'd tell him so. The guy says, a man would like to take a walk. My dad picks up the cigarette, puts it out, and they go for a walk. Third day, same routine. He comes in, he lights a cigarette, he takes a couple of puffs, he drops it on the floor. It's burning a hole in the floor. My dad says, if I were that angry at a man, I'd tell him so. And the guy says, a man would like to go for a walk. And this time, my father leans over and surreptitiously picks up the cigarette and palms it in the hand, so it's sort of hidden. And they get out on the sidewalk. And he turns to the man and he says, sir, I believe this is your cigarette. And the story goes that at that point, my father said, and he had the grace to laugh. He had the grace to laugh. Now, this is actually a really interesting interaction, communication that has taken place that's very much like what happened in the TV show that we watched, where the way in which they were actually communicating and what happened in that communication was able to go somewhere completely different. If my father had said, oh, here's the cigarette, let's put this out now, tell me, tried to get back into direct communication, that could not have happened. But in the communication they did have, there was the communication that allowed this real connection to take place between them, a real connection. And that connection had to do with the joke, right? There was a joke. And it took a while for my dad to get the joke, but he finally got it. And it was also about, which is an interesting word when we're talking about abductive process, is what is the about? It was about the difference of the communication in the medical world and the communication that was happening between those two human beings. The invitation was this way in which they could make communication between two human beings was different than the abstraction of the roles that they were both in, right? So there's a very interesting piece, and I thought it would be a good sort of ghosty story to tell you today.
And we haven't really talked about humor, which is an interesting way of doing it. I mean, and humor is very culturally specific. I mean, if you grew up in Britain, you're trained to use irony as a deadly weapon. Yeah, and you also have a very black sense of humor. And in other cultures, that can be a real problem. I mean, when we were talking with IBM vice presidents from the States, we used to switch irony on and off with HTML code in parallel chat lines just to confuse the hell out of them. Because they didn't understand its use. They thought we were being serious. And I think this how do people say things seriously which are in an unserious way? I mean, narrative does that quite well anyway, but there's a point where you need that. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit. One of the most effective techniques you're taught in rhetoric is a destructive metaphor. If you can associate somebody's argument with something which is, to use the Harry Potter concept, ridiculamus, you've just won, right? And it doesn't matter how illogical it is or how logical if people see the association. And I did that quite cruelly in a conference in Atlanta once. We had some appreciative inquiry people who were basically telling me I was evil because I thought negative stories were valuable. And I waited till the audience were bored with them, and I just associated with them with the final scene of Monty Python's Life of Brian, singing backwards for the singing, always sing, look on the bright side of the light. Now that was really cruel, but they couldn't escape from the association. And this is powerful positive, powerful negative. If you can associate people with a strong metaphorical image, then logic goes out of the window, but you do get change. Right? And I think, we talked about this before. We were formally taught rhetoric from the age of 11, and we actually did impromptu debating every week. Because we were taught it, we were able to resist it. We taught it and we practiced it, right? And I think the ability to argue a case which you don't believe in, which we had to do weekly, is key to developing that ability to see different and novel associations. And you do it in the context of play or a game, not in reality. And we've done work with metaphor-based command languages and metaphor-based simulation games, because in the metaphor, you can explore things you couldn't explore in reality, right? But the learning comes that way because you're disconnecting. Yeah.
I think I feel a certain sorrow around so many of the conversations that I find myself in, Dave. And I'm sad because I just feel the invitation to enter a script.
Yeah.
Like it's already happened. The conversation has taken place before it's begun. And there's no room to move into what was happening in that story, where they transcended what was expected, what was possible. Not because they had some insight, but because they completely moved the conversation into another set of textures and rhythms and logics.
And that's labeling, not metaphor. I mean, if we'd managed to organize that session with you and me at Avebury, which I think we're still planning to do.
Yes.
One of the things I was planning to do was to take you a walk along, to walk at dusk on the ancient highway. It's the oldest road in Europe, which goes past graves. Now, every time I've walked that at dusk, I daren't look behind me, because you never know what else is present, right? Because there's 8,000 years of history built into those stones, right? And it's quite interesting. We're on Halloween. I mean, Ellie and I can tell you stories about the thing which lives at the back of our garden, which we can see and nobody else in the family, well, we can feel, right? One of the things that ghost stories do in that sense of the other or fear or dread is to force you into changing the way you think about things. Yeah, it's like the famous Shakespeare quote, there are more things in heaven and earth than are imagined in your philosophy, Horatio, right? And I think that physical experience of the other is really important in human sense making over the generations. Whether it's right or wrong, it doesn't matter, but that sense of the other is really important because it allows us to connect or disconnect in different ways. And I'm not trying, I shouldn't have told you about that because it's best to take people on the walk and let them discover it for themselves, all right? But
the last time we had a conversation, we talked about the Jenga. And we were talking about what happens when you pull on these ideas that are down at the bottom of the Jenga, and they're not in the list of things that people have in their conversation criteria of important things to talk about. Okay, because those things are actually the consequences of these lower Jenga pieces. And if you pull on those, there's no script that's going to hold it. And actually, it's a bit chaotic. On a good day, it's a bit chaotic. It can get mean and nasty. And so I think what brings that conversation to this conversation is that what we were really talking about is that those things that were down at the bottom of the Jenga, those ideas that are so woven into every other idea, those ones are produced in abductive process.
Yeah, and I think it's the juxtaposition. So, one of my favorite stories is when I was working for IBM and I was summoned down to talk about narrative and complexity to the CIA, which was a bit of a shock, all right? And I met this doddery old guy, and we ended up having a fight for 90 minutes about Patrick O'Brien's Napoleonic warfare novels. And then I saw a picture of him with Ronald Reagan and realized I was talking with Admiral John Poindexter.
Oops.
Fundamentally, as a Welsh socialist, I'm meant to hate. I then worked for him for 10 years. I've stayed at his home. I've been on his yacht. He's a good friend, as is his family, right? Because we discovered this thing in common and we had a conversation before we could take the stereotypes for granted. And I think this is one of my big issues with the whole how you get differences. You need to move people into a different context rather than force them to talk about their differences up front. You move them into a different context so they can discover things which are different or novel, and then that changes the way they discuss their differences. And whenever I confess to being a friend of Admiral John Poindexter in Boston, people stop inviting me for dinner. But yeah.
I think that what is important there is this possibility that there is a way to allow for those gaps in life. Okay, what I'm saying and what you hear are not direct. You're hearing what I say through your experience.
And it comes back to this point about ritual, creating a sense of liminality in which you can explore different things.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really poor on ritual when we encounter strangers. If you go back even 30 or 40 years, there were all sorts of rituals associated with encountering strangers for the first time. And kind of like we lost those in the internet age with instant connectivity with people you've never met before. And I think this fundamental belief ritual is linked with semiotics, is linked with abduction.
Well, it's making room for there to be connected process. And I think, that's one of the issues of having very super clean, direct communication is there's no gapping in it to link with, except that there is. And there is in terms of what is being referenced and the world into which that makes sense is an abductive process. So in order to actually perceive the world differently, we have to do that together. You can't actually do that by yourself. It's in what I would call the common sense, and not necessarily in sense making, but in the sense we share, in the sense we produce together.
There's another aspect which I just picked up in that context is, I mean, Welsh families and Irish families have one thing in common. If we like you, we have an argument with you. If we don't like you, we're polite. It's kind of like, if you've earned our respect, then you've earned the right to have an argument with us. Right? Mm-hmm. And that's because actually when you have arguments with people, you discover novelty. It's not personal, right? And we're losing that capacity. The homogenization doesn't permit for differences. Yeah, and it's the old basic issue on complexity. It's enabling constraints. If you don't have differences, then everything is equiprobable and nothing changes. The issue is, how do we use differences creatively rather than trying to get rid of them?
Well, the beauty of it is you learn about yourself too. When you see somebody thinking differently, you begin to see the edges of your own epistemology, your own confusions, your own assumptions, your own, and I think part of what is lost is the art of being curious in a disagreement and not just being, mean. It's interesting to know. What an incredible opportunity to learn about those things that you weren't seeing.
There are lovely forms, actually. I mean, I was at a conference in Stockholm, and I was on a panel with two people whose views I thought were really, really stupid, but I couldn't say it directly. And one was American and the other was Australian. So I did the standard British joke, and I said, we sent the criminals to Australia and the religious fanatics to America. And we know who got the better deal. And they both thought I was insulting the other person. The Swedes realized I was insulting both of them simultaneously and were rolling around and causing an outcome for the next half hour, right? And again, it's that ability to, that is actually an abductive process. That's a sort of almost like a metaphorical type of argument, association with something. Yeah. And it's using facts in a different way. If you can twist facts into a completely novel context, yeah, that also changes things.
Oh, my friends, you show us how to do it. You've really revealed how to have a conversation across differences, and it has been a total joy. It's been such a generous conversation and meeting.
Telling us we got to stop now, aren't you, Kate? Yeah. I recognize a closing statement if I've ever heard one.
But I feel like we might have to have abduction part 2, right?
Yeah.
And I actually think this session was so it felt wonderfully chaotic. Sometimes it felt like being in a washing machine or rolling down a hill. And there have been so many different phases of the time we've spent together. And it's so interesting to see what breaks through after that. It's somehow, we moved through this weirdness of Halloween and coming together with the Star Trek episode to arrive here and, what riches were shared. So
I think we should set Weirdstone of Brisingamen for the next one. Sorry, somebody mentioned Alan Gardner. And if you haven't read Weirdstone of Brisingamen, you need to read it. There's so many metaphors in that, all right?
Fantastic.
And thank you also to the Cynefin community and to Ellie, to Anna, to Elmi, to Jackie, all who are so vital to making these calls happen. Thank you to the Warm Data community and to everyone who turned up and talked with each other and shared and questioned and patiently waited. And I found it so rich to be together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dave. It's always fun to.
It's always fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, my favorite thing is that we veer off script, and I absolutely know that wherever we're going, we can work it out together, which I think is really important, because partly due to the history of the debate, there is this expectation of a particular rhythm and a particular kind of possibility of being in conversation. And it has its place. The debate is a really wonderful learning format, but it also doesn't have a place. There's a time when it's not a debate.
And it has to be highly ritualized, and it has to be highly staged. It doesn't work in this sort of environment, which is more an open conversation, I think.
I agree.
We need that diversity of discourse mechanisms rather than privileging one type of discourse over another.
And I think being able to perceive the differences between them allows for an abductive process to take place.
And again, that's ritual. The ritual transforms spaces, it enables liminality.
That's right. Yeah. Well, this was really great, you guys. Thank you so much. And until the next,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, both of you.